This is a story of what happened to me. And in telling the story, I wanted to analyze it a little bit more deeply, how it connects with other events in US history, other witch hunts, and trying to understand exactly what's going on at this time period that we are in. So I call this Fired for Feminism, the Anatomy of a Witch Hunt. And the picture is actually, it's a representation of the Salem witch trials. I believe that's Bridget Bishop, the first woman who was convicted in the Salem witch trials. So I definitely identify with her. So I'm going to try to get this things out of the way so I can proceed here. Okay, so on May 11th, I was fired without warning from my job of almost 20 years as a civil rights attorney at Disability Rights California, known as DRC for short. And the reason why I was fired was for my outside feminist political activity, specifically in Feminists in Struggle, and for declaring that abortion bans harm women as a sex. That was my crime. So one may want to ask, how could something like that happen, and by a liberal civil rights employer, no less? Disability Rights California is a large nonprofit in the state of California. It gets government money, federal and state money to advocate for people with disabilities. I've done a lot of good work, and the organization as a whole has done excellent work on behalf of people with disabilities. So how, it's just bizarre that something like this could happen at a place like that. So what is going on here? So this is my effort, as I said, to inform people about what exactly happened to me and to help all of us to understand the incident better in the context of other events in American history when there were witch hunts, and to help organize a fight back on behalf of myself and the many other women and some men whose jobs and livelihoods have been threatened or taken from them because they speak out for sex-based rights of women and girls, or just recognize there's such a thing as sex. And those rights, sex-based rights, include the right to safe, legal, and accessible abortion, which we recently lost through the US Supreme Court Dobbs decision. And what happened to me is very connected with the issue of abortion and how we fight for abortion rights as well. So what is a witch hunt? So I was trying to find all the commonalities in a witch hunt, witch hunts and different kinds of witch hunts. How can I draw the connections here? So here's some definitions. It's an attempt to find and punish a particular group of people who are being blamed for something, often simply because of their opinions and not because they have actually done anything wrong. It's also an investigation carried out ostensibly to uncover disloyalty, subversive political activity, and it often relies on inconclusive evidence and capitalizes on public fear of unpopular opinions. So there's a certain common themes with witch hunts. First, there's a demonization of a group which actually in the real world has very little real power, and yet is portrayed as extremely dangerous and the epitome of evil. But there's another aspect to that, and that is that it's a preemptive strike, basically, that there's a recognition of a future potential threat. So even if that group is small, there's a fear that they could become more influential, they could really change society. So we're going to get them before they have a chance. And that's a preemptive strike aspect to a witch hunt. Then there's the misogyny, which are themes in certain witch hunts. Certainly the witch trials, misogyny was very prominent. And so in the modern anti-feminist witch hunt, it's definitely anti-feminist, anti-female. And there's a tendency to target older women. And so what's that about? But if we look into the history of the Salem witch trials, and I think probably other witch trials, but I know the Salem witch trials the best. I've been reading up on it. The accusers were they were teenage girls actually, and they were accusing the older women in the community. So there's that pattern. Then there's authoritarianism, fear, and intimidation, which are used to silence any potential opponents. There's scapegoating, basically blaming folks, blaming this unpopular group or the group that's targeted in order to divert attention to the real cause of problems that people are suffering. There's an aspect of mass participation or support of witch hunting. Witch hunting is not something that's done by one person in isolation. It's basically a pile-on. Basically, it needs cheerleaders. It needs people to go along and actively support it. And there's guilt by association. Basically, anyone who defends a witch or associates with a witch is a witch. There's punishment for thought crimes, basically bad ideas that are dangerous, and with, of course, a chilling effect on the free speech of everyone. There's conviction without due process, or in the case of the witch hunts, in the witch hunt in Salem, spectral evidence, and in the case of me as well, spectral evidence. It's the idea that you can kind of torment someone from afar by your thoughts or words. That certainly was an issue in my case, that I was thought to have that kind of power. And then there's the naming of names or the condemning of witches to avoid suspicion on oneself. And so people will attack the despised group being witch hunted because they don't want to be seen as a witch. They don't want to be seen as a communist. They don't want to be seen as a quote unquote TERF. So they're going to, condemn people, go along with the crowd in order to avoid attacks on themselves. And there's also the naming of names, and that also happens in witch hunts. The ACLU during the McCarthy era actually was reporting suspicious people to the FBI. I mean, so there's histories of this kind of stuff. When there's been anti-lesbian witch hunts in the military, people were pressured to name names in order to decrease the punishment to themselves. And that was also true with the Salem witch hunts as well. So here's some witch hunts in US history that have a lot to teach us. And I've been reading up, I really got into this recently because of what happened to me. So I've been reading about US history and the anti-red scares, etc., and the McCarthy era. There's, of course, the Salem witch trials. That was 1692 to 1693. There was the Red Scare during World War I, and also into the early 1920s, the Palmer raids. The targets were socialists, the IWW, anarchists, immigrants, any kind of union activists, and people who were protesting World War I. So that was a major witch hunt in the United States. And Eugene Debs, who was running for president as a socialist, ended up being in prison because of his anti-war activity. He ran for office, I think, the second time while he was in prison. Then the well-known McCarthy era, which was another, probably the worst Red Scare in US history. Loyalty oaths require people had to sign that they were not ever a communist and would have nothing to do with communists, and that sort of thing, which I compare now to having to put your pronouns on your signature line. Loyalty oaths, blacklisting, where people would be fired from one job and then in the whole industry where they worked, they wouldn't be able to get a job. This happened even in the union movement, where radicals and socialists and communists were purged from the unions, which weakened, of course, the unions. So that was a major thing into the 40s and into the 1950s. Then I had mentioned the anti-lesbian witch hunts in the military, which happened for decades, actually. I think all the way probably to 2010, but certainly in the 80s and 90s, and there was a lot of that. 70s, 80s, and 90s. And now we have two contemporary witch hunts in the United States. One is the no forming of leftist and anti-war journalists from mainstream publications and social media. And Julian Assange is probably the best example of that, facing prison under the Espionage Act, which goes back to the first Red Scare, by the way, World War I. Chris Hedges, who was fired from the New York Times for being against the Iraq War. So there's a of journalists. And then, of course, the contemporary, quote unquote, turf hunting and no platforming of gender critical feminists. So where is this taking place? I'm trying to draw connections as well for the where this stuff is happening, where women are being targeted in particular. And so it seems like it's in the professional settings the most. And it may be that I'm missing other things that don't get the same publicity, but my impression is that it's lawyers and authors and artists and university professors where women are most vulnerable for the crimes of recognizing the existence of sex. And these are fields where women have made the most gains since the rise of the second wave. And so it appears to be the primary targets currently. The nonprofit world is really interesting because I've been immersed in that for a few decades. Actually, I was at DRC for 20 years. Before that, I was at Legal Aid. So it has certain interesting characteristics because the law profession was, when I first got into law school, was overwhelmingly male, and then they started letting a lot of women in, and women, got into law school like my first year, from 10% of the body to over a third of the body within a year. So lawyers, female lawyers became more common, but the legal world is still sexist, and it's not an equal playing field for women at all. Women tend to be concentrated in the nonprofit sector and also in the government sector, where there's been more opportunities. It's much more difficult to succeed in private practice or to advance in law firms. In the nonprofit world, there are some men. There is overwhelmingly female, but there's some men, and those male lawyers that do work there.
And can I interrupt you for a moment?
Sure.
All the noise that's happening in the background is going to be on the recording as well. I just thought you might want to know that. Okay,
I don't know. I'm not hearing any other noise right now. Is there any other noise that I'm not hearing?
Yeah.
Is everybody muted? Make sure everybody's muted.
Everybody should be muted.
Right.
People do that?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that a lot of people have been coming into the meeting, so there's a ding every time that happens.
Yeah, there's nothing. Yeah.
I don't hear the ding. What I'm hearing is banging and dishes and lots of other noise.
Somebody's unmuted. What
I hear
happens?
those noises too.
It's
Yeah.
the person behind the host who's moving things, and we
That
can
was
hear
just for
her.
a second. It's not happening right now.
Okay, but just so you know, when new people come in, they may not be muted, so you have to check.
Okay.
And whoever is a co-host has the option of clicking the mute all button at any time to make sure everyone is muted.
I guess my only fear would be I wouldn't want to mute Anne.
You wouldn't be muting Anne. It would be impossible to do that.
Okay. So anyway, so the females that are working in the nonprofit.
Okay, so now you have to unmute yourself, Anne. I put mute all.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. So so I was saying it's overwhelmingly female in the nonprofit legal world, and the females are disproportionately found at the top. There tends to be a culture of micromanagement, which again limits the opportunities for the women lawyers that work there. It's mostly non-union, at will employment, often underpaid. So DRC was paid pretty well, but most are underpaid. And there's been a growing influence of gender identity ideology and corporate style diversity, equity, and inclusion that have gained a strong foothold, as they cost nothing to the agency and eliminate the troublesome category of sex, and while keeping the staff in their silos, preventing them from uniting, for example, to organize a union. Let's see. Should be next. What happened here? Here we go. So how did references to biological sex become transphobic hate speech at my agency? I explained a little bit about DRC as being the largest, one of the largest, if not the largest, nonprofit legal firm in California. The corporate style diversity training, which is developed by corporate consultants, the same people that train McDonald's, any kind of big corporations. The same consultants have been training the people in the nonprofit world. And the extreme wing of gender identity ideology, which disappears sex, has become more and more prominent, and where gender and gender identity is substituted for sex or overrides sex. We were taught that sex was a spectrum and an invention of white colonialism. Sexual orientation in our last trainings was redefined as same gender attraction. We were actually prohibited from using he or she in our letters and briefs. That's pretty amazing. And so rather than learning to work together respectfully among a diverse group of people with a range of ethnicities and cultures and beliefs, we were all expected to agree. And the focus became pronouns and identities, allowing for virtue signaling without substantive improvements in the agency's functioning. And asking questions or disagreeing, which I did politely always, or declining to declare your preferred pronouns, which were recommended but not technically mandatory, was enough to label me and others who would do something like that a transphobe. And what this paves the way for is a cliquishness, a kind of a junior high school gossip thing going on, and then escalating to ostracism, authoritarianism, and witch hunting, and in my case, termination. So what happened? Where was the crime? This is what happened. In response to the leak of the Dobbs decision on May 5th, our executive director, being the liberal progressive person that he is and that the agency sees themselves as, announced on the all staff list, which is our email list that goes to everybody, several hundred people on our staff, that DRC had made a public statement in support of Roe v. Wade, opposing the overturning of Roe v. Wade, and then inviting staff comment. So this was sent to our all staff list. The DRC statement, which had already been released, mentioned every possible group that might conceivably be impacted by a reversal of Roe, except women. Quote, the reversal would disproportionately negatively impact the most vulnerable populations, including people with disabilities, people of color, people living in poverty, and those without the means of travel. The executive director later clarified that they purposely used, quote, inclusive, unquote, language which excluded females. So having been invited to make comment, I did. I responded on May 6th on the email, and this is exact quote. So glad DRC came up with a statement in defense of Roe. Thank you. Access to safe legal abortion is a life and death necessity for women as a biological sex across the board, regardless of race, economic class, gender identity, sexual orientation. Even lesbians can be raped or anything else. And an absolute prerequisite for equal female participation in society. Of course, the most vulnerable females, especially poor women, women of color, women with disabilities, young girls, unhoused women and girls in prison, etc., will suffer the most under draconian anti-abortion laws. As a veteran of the feminist struggle for abortion rights that preceded Roe, I never thought it would come to this. Thanks again, DRC, for taking a stand. That's what I said. But those who are familiar with the trans or gender identity ideology and where it's gone, the existence of biological sex is not to be mentioned in polite company. So I was immediately reprimanded by a person high up in the agency. Quote, many people whose gender is not female can become pregnant, and DRC's all staff email list is no place to circulate statement that tries to erase that. And then the full onslaught began. I was called a TERF, a hate monger, in my seemingly mild language, a quote, dog whistle, unquote, that would result in, quote, serious violence and stigma against trans people who need abortions, unquote. Like in the Salem witch trials, my thoughts and words were supposed to have secret meaning and be so powerful that I could torment my victims from afar. And the person who initiated the most vicious attacks on me had been doing research way ahead of this meeting, had been following my political activities, listen to my videos for FIST in my forums, and so started quoting me, quoted me things that I had said, of course, out of context, to defame me as a hateful and bigoted person. So they were basically waiting to strike. They'd already identified me as a quote TERF unquote. They were ready to strike. They had done the research, and for my mild statement about the impact of abortion bans on females, female half of humanity, was their green light to go ahead and attack me. So I said I was in shock. I mean, I just really didn't expect that from what I said. I said, this is defamatory, it needs to stop, let's take this off list. People want to talk to me politely. Glad to discuss it with them on our own time and just take this off list. And I also clarified that I was talking about sex and not gender. And privately, people did email me and express sympathy for what I said. And one co-worker said, "Isn't TERF a slur?" I said, "Yeah, it is actually." But so that was on a Friday. All of that was on a Friday. The following Monday, I had a previously scheduled civil rights practice group meeting. Those are the attorneys and support staff that work on civil rights cases for our agency. And that meeting was supposed to be in the afternoon. People met behind my back on Monday morning and basically found me guilty as charged. They issued a statement condemning me. We, quote, "We, Disability Rights California's Civil Rights Practice Group, want to clearly state we support, value, and celebrate our trans colleagues. We reject any actions that would deny or minimize their full identities. The members of this team acknowledge the threat to civil rights presented by the May 6th all-staff correspondence." They were talking about me. Quote, "The opinion expressed by one of our current members," that's yours, Julie, "does not reflect the Civil Rights Practice Group's values or mission." Unquote. So that was, that's about the worst thing in an agency like DRC you could say about someone, that they are not, their politics or their opinions don't reflect the values or mission of the agency. And basically that's what they said. You could be a bad lawyer, that would be one thing, but if you don't share these opinions or these values, then you're, you know, a very, very bad person who doesn't belong there, basically. So this was an escalation for sure. I responded that I believe this was homophobic, because the reason it's homophobic, as most of you know, is the sex doesn't exist, sexual orientation doesn't exist, and lesbians are disappeared as well, and have no way of, you know, having a life as a lesbian, basically. So I said this was homophobic and McCarthy-like, bullying. And I did try to explain my position as a gender nonconforming lesbian, explain that I supported everyone's rights, but I believed it was important to maintain sex as well as sexual orientation as a distinct protected class. So that was Monday. On Tuesday, I got contacted by my supervisor who wanted to have a meeting with me. The following day, I said, I have this appointment in the morning. I'm going to be really numb. And can we put that off a little bit? We hadn't set aside a time. I went to my dentist appointment in the morning. While I was on the chair, I got 2 phone calls that I couldn't answer. When I got off the chair, there was a text message from my management saying that I was fired. No warning, no nothing. I have a completely clean record in my 20 years of work there, fighting really hard for my clients. And they went as so far as to deny my unemployment benefits because of my misconduct and abuse of my trans coworkers. So what are we going to do about these type of attacks? Because I know I'm completely aware that I'm not the only one. I'm lucky that I have Social Security and Medicare and a little bit of savings, and I was able to survive despite, you know, my income being immediately stopped and unemployment being denied. I know other people don't have that luxury, but we have to make it so it's safe to be a feminist in the workplace, that we are not fired for our feminist views or for our outside feminist activities. So we've launched a campaign for justice for me. And we have a statement of solidarity that we are just asking for people to sign. And you can see the links over there. My case is described on this website, defendfeminist.net, and there will be updates placed there. I have also hired a lawyer, and within the next few weeks, maybe next week or maybe the week after, there should be a lawsuit filed. So I think the filing a lawsuit as well as a political campaign I have nothing to be ashamed of, but DRC does have something to be ashamed of about the way they treated me. And we have to make it so it's not acceptable for feminists to be treated like that, to be afraid of saying their opinions. You know, being afraid to be active in feminist work because they could be fired. That has to stop. So witch hunts only end when enough people speak out and say enough is enough. Ending with a few quotes. This is one I love from Christabel Pankhurst. Remember the dignity of your womanhood. Do not appeal, do not beg, do not grovel. Take courage. Join hands, stand beside us, fight with us. And then I wanted to quote Joseph Welch, who basically held Senator Joseph McCarthy accountable at the Army McCarthy hearings in 1954. Have you no sense of decency? That's a famous statement he made. So I say, have you no sense of decency, DRC? And that's it for me.